Welcome back to another episode of the Supply Chain podcast. My name is Nathan Cheney, and I am your host on this journey. And today we're really excited to have Anant Jain join us today and talk all about supply chain planning. Anant is one of the few folks that I know that I think are specialists. I might even call him an expert in it, but I'll let him defend that later on. So Anant, really great to have you on, and I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about planning today. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Nathan, firstly, thank you for having me. I really appreciate that. And also all the great work you're doing in this area just to bring supply chain to everybody. I think post-COVID, I keep telling people, my parents didn't know what I did. Then post-COVID, I think they understand what supply chain is and I think have an idea of what I do. So thank you very much. From a background perspective, as you probably hear from the accent, although I live in Dallas, I'm not from West Texas. I was born and brought up in Scotland, and so started my career there, did undergrad and postgrad, and then from postgrad joined, that's where I really sort of found my sea legs with supply chain. I joined a supply chain software company called i2 Technologies, which I think many people know. It's now became JDA and it Blue Yonder and part of Panasonic now. And so I really learned and got my background and experience there with i2 doing sort of supply chain planning, consulting work for large, blue chip companies. And this was in the late 90s, early 2000s. And I'd probably sort of say supply chain planning had a renaissance, where at that time, it's sort of some of the front people on the cutting edge, company-wise, were sort of realizing, oh, this is important. Now as we're coming to it, people have put in technology, and now with all the new technologies available, with the big data, large computing, generative AI, they're sort of going through a renaissance with the next phase of this. But that's sort of where I sort of cut my teeth. And that was on the technology side. Then I got an opportunity to get into management consultancy to sort of broaden that a little bit, be less technology focused. Then I had a couple of stints in industry, sort of being on the other side of the fence. And then did some work for myself, which was very interesting. And then most recently gone back into management consultancy and doing supply chain planning for Ernst & Young.
So it sounds like you've started pretty early on and planned to get into supply chain from the beginning. Like what is it that you studied in school?
Oh, no, good. I think with a lot of these things, you sort of just fall into it. And so I did engineering, industrial engineering.
Okay.
And then in my sort of senior year, we had to do a project. And my supervisor was into like engineering and sort of shop floor, but then he wanted to use sort of interesting techniques. So he sort of was dabbling in neural networks. And now that's become infamous now because of AI and things like that. But the basic premise was something called a back error propagation neural network, which means it's self-learning. You give it an input, it gives you an output, and you tell it, oh, this is wrong, and then it starts to learn from that. So your generative AI algorithms sort of work on neural networks in the same principle. And this was in the mid-90s. We did that. And so that was on, when I did my undergrad, we tried to do it on complex problems. And so we wanted to do one on the shop floor. And so we started to use that. And so then after that, I stayed with my supervisor and did my PhD. And my PhD was on scheduling in the job shop, where it's what's known as a hard problem. Whereas if you start increasing the number of machines and orders, it exponentially becomes more complicated. And so we were using heuristics and things like that. And then after I graduated, I got a couple of job offers. 2 were development and 1 was consulting with i2. And that was what sort of got me into supply chain. So it was a little bit, not planned as these things. And so I sort of fell into it at that time.
What is it that kind of drew you to go? You said a while ago that you had an option to go development route or to go consulting route. And I kind of had a similar decision whenever I was finishing school as well. I kind of thought I wanted to be a consultant. And I'm glad I ultimately did not go that route. I think it turned out for the best for me. But what made you make that decision, and how did that contribute to kind of like where your career went afterwards?
I'm actually glad that I did do consulting. For development, because as part of my PhD, I was, coding sort of all the algorithms for the job shop problem on the shop floor, and I thought, look, I just don't want to be sitting in front of my computer all day, but sort of try and get a little bit more hands-on. And sort of, work with clients and things like that. So that's why I wanted to go more in consulting. I thought it would be a little bit more practical as opposed to just being behind the scenes, making the algorithms, but trying to implement them and sort of see how they can be used. And then obviously taking that information and then going back to people who are developing them and tell them sort of what tweaks and things need to be done.
So you wanted to be a little bit more hands-on, and so consulting gave you that ability. And you said you kind of also pivoted over into the client or into the customer side to be on that side of the fence. What kind of dynamics or what kind of experiences did you have shifting from one side of the table to the other? Any stories or takeaways from that?
Yeah. Truthfully, I think I struggled going on the other side, which is why I sort of came back to consulting.
Okay.
But it was more just one thing with consulting is there's a lot of travel. And you're out on the road all the time and things like that, and that can sometimes get tough. And also in consulting, credibility is very important, and so people need to understand, hey, have you lived in their shoes? Have you done what they've done? So you're coming and preaching or telling them, hey, you need to do this to make improvements. And they're like, yeah, but what do you know? You're just a consultant. If you can say, hey, I've worked in industry, I've worked for the chief supply chain officer, so I know what's important to him and understand that, and then communicate that to the person, then there's a lot more credibility. Okay, you understand life, what I am living, what I have to go through, and appreciate that. So I think that way is better. So I think having that experience, I think was ultimately helpful and to improve me and make me a better consultant as well.
So it's interesting that you brought up the fact that consultants, travel a lot. And also I really appreciate your point about whenever you are in front of a client, having had lived experience and being in their shoes is an important way of having credibility and gaining trust. One thing that I realized, after stumbling into consulting later on in my career, I realized what was I thinking coming straight out of school, thinking I was thinking about being a consultant. I hadn't actually worked in industry much. I hadn't had that real experience to be able to go into somewhere and say, here's how you should do it, right? Or here's some help from my expert background, because I didn't have it. And so actually, although it wasn't planned, after making a series of stops through various parts of the supply chain, I now actually felt like I was able to have that credibility to be able to do a little bit of that work. But I suppose it might be a different situation because I was coming out of undergrad with a supply chain degree and you were coming out with a PhD. So you kind of actually were a bit of an expert right out of the box, I guess.
I wouldn't say that. I think because I was working for a software vendor and the client was implementing that technology, that's where the expertise at least came in, because I learned the software, knew the software, and was implementing the software. So that's where, as an implementer, I had some expertise and credibility. But then there was other people within the team with more broader industry experience who understood, whether it was consumer goods or whether it was high tech or semiconductor, who knew those industries, who could then talk credibly to the client, the chief supply chain officer, of what it meant implementing that planning software in their industry and what the implications, etc., of that were.
So talking a little bit about our different experiences coming out of school and our first jobs and how I was reluctant to take that consulting job at the beginning, could you talk a little bit about to the students, to the early career folks that are listening to this podcast, and kind of weigh in on if they're trying to make that decision of, do I go into the manufacturer side, into a client side of this, or I'm considering going into the consulting side?
Sure. One advantage I would say about consulting is you get a lot of broad experience very quickly, and you'll get diverse industries and things like that. So what you'll probably learn in consulting in 2 or 3 years might be equivalent to industry for 4 or 5 years. And so if you're young, you're able to travel and go around. That's the advantage of being, of doing consulting. Then after that, after 2 or 3 years, you can sort of decide, do I do some postgraduate qualification like an MBA or something like that? Or then do I want to go into industry? And I think it gives you a good base. The only thing you got to be wary about is that once you start to get to about a manager level, making the transition becomes difficult, because then you've been a consultant at that manager level. If you wanted to go back to industry as a manager, then they're usually looking for somebody that has experience in their industry or in that particular area for several years. And you wouldn't probably want to go back to the start again. So I would sort of say that the juncture is probably after that 3-4 year point to sort of decide. That's probably a good point then to go back if you wanted to.
Gotcha. And how about from a studies perspective for those students again? If they want to be like you one day and do what you're doing in the planning sort of aspect of supply chain, is there any particular courses or other certifications or types of things that they might pursue to put them in the best position to be your colleague one day?
Sure. I think there's, when I was at school, there wasn't really supply chain management degrees. Now, many schools do supply chain management. And locally, for example, UTD, University of Texas at Dallas, has a very strong program for supply chain management. And even TCU has a great program too. So that's just locally. And then nationally, there's, many good schools that offer that. So doing a supply chain management degree, if this is the area you want to get into, I think really helps, because it gives you a great foundation and background. But then there's lots of great institutes, CSCMP, SCORE, ISM, they all provide APEX, they all provide really good sort of background knowledge and give you a great base as well. So even if you've not necessarily done a supply chain management degree, some of these other institutes that offer these certifications are really strong. And then obviously, once you get into it, it's, whether you're in industry or consulting, then sort of, biting your teeth and getting into all of that stuff, I think really helps.
I see. And you kind of almost took a couple of the questions that I was planning to ask out of my brain already there, which was how you kind of continue to upskill yourself and stay current on the latest trends and kind of what's going on in the industry. And I get the feeling maybe some of those groups that you just mentioned, like ISM and Apex and SCORE, are some of those ways. Is there anything else?
There's sort of so many complementary things. Data and analytics is very important. So you can start to learn a little bit about those things, data analytics, understanding different tools and how visualization of information, because at the end of the day, you have to make decisions, but you need the information coming to you and understanding what that information is meaning in order to make decisions. So, understanding things like that. And then just, how is the business functioning and running? So basic sort of, finance and sort of things you would learn in MBA school and things like that are also, I would say, extremely helpful. So a lot of the adjunct things that you would think about from supply chain, just around the business, the finance, how a company runs, I think are all extremely helpful and help to augment your sort of overall understanding and experience, I think, of supply chain.
Let's maybe back up just a hair, because from my perspective, planning is kind of in the corner of the supply chain industry. It's a little bit specialized, at least in the circles that I run around in, which is very much warehousing and manufacturing and transportation heavy.
Correct.
So how would you describe the planning function for someone who is in the transportation field or in the warehousing and distribution field and really doesn't come across planning much?
I think when people think of supply chain, it's the transportation and logistics that really, and warehousing that people really think about. And then planning is one area, and I would say the other area is procurement, getting product from your supplier. So if for somebody on the transportation and warehouse perspective, the simplest way, and I'll get a little more detail, is that the planning function is the function that gets you the product available for you to then pick up. So we make sure the product is there, be it at the plant or at the DC, for you to then go and pick up. So planning is that overall piece where you just think about yourself. You put an order and you want that product to then get to you. Now, the product might, if it's already there, then it's a distribution problem. But what happens if the product isn't there? You then have to go and make the product and maybe have to go to the supplier and procure some material. So that whole process of making sure, based on when you've asked for it or somebody's asked for it, all that piece to make sure all of the components, raw materials, manufacturing, production, and transportation all happen. All of that organization and tying together is usually done from the planning function.
Is it possible to say that the chip shortage during COVID time of computer chips, because you mentioned semiconductors earlier, was that a planning failure, or was planning's role, did they have a hand in that?
So the chip shortage, I think, was probably two things. One was commodity shortage. So, all the raw materials required in order to make the wafers and the chips. And then another thing was demand, or the spike of demand. So then it was a demand and supply imbalance. So it's, for example, I have capability to make 100, but people are wanting 10,000. How does that then work? And so that's where then you saw that issue. So then that's where planning would come in to try and say, okay, what can I do? First of all, you're asking for 10,000. I can only make 100. And so there's an allocation issue. Who's getting that 100? That was one decision. Then I need to start planning and going back to my suppliers and sort of say, hey, I need 10,000. What can you do? When can you do it to bring it in? And so they will make the 10,000, but it's not that I need that, that I can get it delivered in 2 or 3 months. It maybe takes 6 or 7 months to get there, but then they will try and plan that backlog to try and hit that demand. So planning was probably there to try and improve the process, but I think it was sort of the typical demand and supply balancing issues, and the commodity issue, I think, is what really caused the chip shortage.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's two kind of sides of planning, or two specialties in it, which is demand planning and supply planning somewhat. Correct. And then I guess an overarching umbrella that wraps all that up into one planning function.
Correct. And that would be the S&OP, or sales and operations, or integrated business planning. So correct. Okay. The two main pieces when you think about it are demand planning, where you're thinking about what are your customers wanting, or trying to predict what your customers are wanting with forecasting and things like that.
And are you talking with marketing and sales a little bit in that to make sure you're on the same page,
yes, right? 100%. Yeah. Sales, marketing, account managers and things like that. Sometimes, if you're lucky, you can even try and collaborate with your customers, and they can sort of help you on some of that thing. So that would be on the demand side. And that gives you a picture of what you believe you need. You then give that to the supply organization, and they will say, how much of that can I make? So demand organization says 100, supply says, given all of my constraints and things like that, I can only do 90. And then that ties up to sales and operations planning, who will then start to run various things. The executives will say, okay, I can maybe give you some more capacity, then you can make the 100, or it's going to cost this much to do this or that. Which of these things do we want to do? So that's sort of the main pieces together. But then you've also got, as I talked about, customer, supplier, and then there's also transportation and logistics as well.
I would imagine that from your perspective, and I think it's probably rightfully so, that planning is kind of step one of the supply chain process. You're the first ones to come up with what the plan is going to be for the rest of the succeeding components and steps that take place. Would you say that's about right?
Yes, and if you see also the SCORE model, it's plan. Plan is the first step. So it's plan, source, right, make, deliver, return, enable. So plan is the first piece, correct?
Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
We want to come in. It's a bit of a chicken and egg, because people still have to execute, but you come with a plan, try and put that in place, and then people work from that.
Everything that you've said here today so far makes me think that you know what you're doing in this space, and that you almost have probably never made a mistake, but I'm pretty darn sure that's not the case. So could you share an example of where something has gone wrong? A decision or a button was clicked or something was overlooked, just so that for the rest of us, we can just understand that you're a human being and that you make mistakes as well, and maybe kind of what you learned from that.
No, 100%. And if you ask my team, and I'll tell you truthfully, I make mistakes every day. Sometimes, if you ask them, they'll probably say I have no idea what I'm doing. But I think there was one sort of project that we were doing helping a client with their planning problems, and they were looking to, make some decisions and then promote those to the test environment to test, and then to promote them to production to then work. And they were sort of not fully sure about what they wanted to do. And so I was sort of making some decisions. We made them in test. I made changes in test and then promoted them to production without fully testing them, which in hindsight was probably one of the most stupidest things I've ever done. And then the client was in production and saying, why the hell isn't this working as we said it would work? And they were like, no. I said, well, this is what I've done. And, really got my hand slapped. And so just understanding that when you're making decisions, going through the full life cycle, being, fully transparent and communicating what you're doing and things like that. I think that was a big lesson that I learned. And so obviously now, making sure, you follow the whole process. This was obviously, a technology piece and how you move forward with that, but just in general, from an overall learning perspective of making sure if this is the defined process, or this is what we've said the process is going to be, making sure we follow that fully. And again, if there's any issues or problems, being very transparent and communicating that.
I have my biggest failure that I typically tell people about is similar in that I had a process in place. I worked it for a little while, and then I got a bit lazy and did not continue to maintain and work that process that was set out, and suffered the consequences, massively of that. At the time, you just want to run away and hide under a rock and never show your face again, right? But it turns out that those really massive failures turn out to be, obviously some of the best learning lessons, because you have the deepest scars from them. So it's amazing to see that, even the most, sharpest sort of folks around still also make mistakes. So I want to give you an opportunity to redeem yourself here a little bit and talk a little bit about your proudest achievement or your crowning jewel of your career so far.
I think it was again with the same client, and they were sort of struggling. They'd been, as typical you get with sales, especially in software sales, they were overpromised something, and were overpromised some capabilities, and were using it and were struggling for 2 or 3 years with it, and got really fed up. And so came back to us and said, look, this isn't working. What can you do? And we said, okay, we're going with this newer platform capability. Let us come in and do for free a proof of concept. And this wasn't just a proof of concept for 2 or 3 weeks. This was something we went on site for 5 months, got all of their data, and then provided them an end-to-end capability, all the way from demand management to master data management, to demand management, and then supply management at sort of 3 levels. Was sort of at a monthly level, a weekly level, and a daily level, and then some execution capabilities, and sort of painfully got their data, walked them through it, defined some new processes and things like that, and then sort of even got our CEO at that time to do a video, sort of, when we sort of were delivering it, sort of explaining all of that. Then we had a sort of full day demonstration. They sort of were really happy, liked what they saw, and then took a license where they got unlimited. They could buy any of our software for 5 years. And so then we went on a end-to-end journey across different sites, actually implementing and delivering that. So it was very, very painful, with lots of hand slapping, put under a lot of pressure, and then sort of, coming out of that. And normally I've found is that my best learning experiences and where I've grown the most is where something has not gone as well as it should have done. And I've sort of had to step back, really learn, understand, change. And then I think coming out of that, I've come out of that as a better person.
I fully agree. And I want for that theme to be echoed through lots of the guests that come on here, so that the people that are hearing this can understand that even if they're kind of under a dark cloud at the moment, they just kind of did something dumb, that, that those are the opportunities actually to learn the best. And Tom Clark, I think my second podcast guest, put it best when he said, you as a leader or someone on that team owe it to yourself to pause at some point and reflect on how you brought this about and what you're going to do differently next time. And if you don't take that time, you're really doing a bit of a disservice, and you're probably going to do this thing again, possibly. So it's not so much that the error occurred; it's how you react to it and how you make up for it, and then what you learn going forward, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. I think that I couldn't have a podcast these days talking to an industry professional without asking about the impact of AI and machine learning on your field. So I'm just going to put that there and let you take it where you want to.
When it comes to planning and the data aspect, AI is a key part to that. But there's two aspects of AI. There's the generative AI, which is relatively newer, but then there's the AI and machine learning aspect, which has actually been around for a little bit of time. So if you take, for example, demand forecasting, you can use AI and ML techniques to enhance and improve the forecast. But where generative AI can really help is a lot of those decisions are very data dependent. And as a lot of times you will not have all of that data. There'll be holes, there'll be gaps. And so it's sort of a two-step process where you can have the generative AI to sort of fill in some of those gaps. And then you can have the machine learning then to take that information and then to try to enhance and improve it. And so that's where, that duopoly of those two areas of AI is something that's, there on the supply chain side. What also we find a lot is that as supply chain practitioners is we're just overwhelmed again with data and questions come up. But now, like how you have with ChatGPT, you can go and ask it questions. Similarly, on the supply chain side, you can do the same and sort of ask questions like, how is my inventory levels? Where am I stocked out? What are my top customers? There's so many questions you can ask. And now you've got the capability where it can go in and bring all of that information or the relevant information and then communicate that to you to then help, supplement or do whatever process or decision making you're wanting to do. So that's there. Another thing, as we as consultants, you can use that also for implementation and training of how do you implement and train the client on the software or the capabilities of the process where, hey, they're trying to do something and they're not sure. They can go in and sort of, okay, what's the next step that I need to follow? What's the next step I need to do? So it can also be there for a training and learning perspective. So there's, a lot of areas or capabilities where this can really be leveraged and I think will definitely enhance. But I think the key thing, and everybody worries about is, well, if this is all going to come in, is that going to replace me or replace a planner? And the answer is hell no. To be very, very clear, because you can go in and that can give you the information, but you need the planner with the expertise to then decide, what do I need to do? Okay, I have a problem. It's brought me this information. I'm then maybe going to run a few scenarios to try and figure out what are my alternatives. And you can use the AI piece to run the scenarios, bring the information. Then you have to decide which of these am I going to choose and why. So the planning piece is still, and having the human is still fundamental, but a lot of that heavy lift can be done with the AI or the Gen AI pieces.
It must be not too different maybe from when the advent of Microsoft Excel came out and electronic spreadsheets came out. It was a tool that allowed you to be much more efficient and do calculations and modeling so much faster that I would imagine at that time in the 90s or something that people were concerned that spreadsheets and Excel was going to reduce headcount need or something, I guess, in departments. It's kind of probably the same story, just different verse this time.
100%. Even when I started my career, it was like, oh, we're going to have these planning tools that are going to revolutionize and everything will be automated and I don't need planners. And then fast forward 20 years now with the further improvements in technology and people think that. That's still not the case. I still need people to sort of take the information and decide what to do with it.
Is there something that's more basic, something that's very fundamental to the planning process that keeps you up at night, sort of, that maybe AI and computers is not going to solve?
I think if I'm a supply planner, is change. What's the change? When is it coming? How am I going to deal with it? Because again, depending on what planner you are, as you're getting closer to more of the execution piece, things are always changing. How can I handle that? How can I deal with that? What's there? And so if they can try and get ahead of that as much as possible, and that's what we try and help on the planning piece, is coming up with understanding. Problems are always going to arise. A machine breaks down, the truck doesn't come, the client wanted, customer asked for this, then change their mind. So change will, always those kinds of things will happen. But how can I try and get ahead of that? How can I deal with that? I think that's what keeps us at night, to try and make sure the planner can handle that efficiently and as quickly as possible.
I feel like a planner is a good prospect for moving up in an organization because they have to have such a holistic view of what an organization does. Is having some time on the planning side of an organization a good career move for someone who's looking to get into the C-suite of a big CPG or manufacturer or something like that?
Oh, it's huge credibility. And you
Okay.
find a lot of times in these organizations, the chief supply chain officer or the VP of supply chain, they've either come from the warehouse or the distribution center or transportation, or they've come from planning. And those that have sort of come through planning to sales and operations planning, etc., really understand the business, the pains and the challenges. And I think it provides an excellent sort of backdrop for them to then play those more senior roles and really understand and appreciate the business and how things work.
That's awesome. My second podcast guest talked a little bit about that career paths within supply chain, and one of the things I think that I've learned also throughout my career, some with some Fortune 500 companies, is that as you move kind of vertically, it kind of requires a lot of horizontal moves throughout a supply chain organization, so that by the time you are up, making bigger, more holistic type decisions, strategic decisions, you need to have a good fundamental grasp of a lot of the different components of that organization and that business in order to make the best decisions possible, right? Is there anything at that upper level? A while ago I asked you the question about if you were starting out in college, if you're early in your career, what would you do? Is there any advice that you can kind of give to the strategic leaders of companies these days? Kind of like a note from the planning department to all those folks of something that would help your jobs maybe be a little easier.
I think as from a planning side, I would say is just keep the planning team in the loop of what you're trying to do. Another thing is when you look at an organization, a lot of times they're very siloed, and one part of the organization is doing something differently from the other part of the organization. I think it's important to have common KPIs, goals, and objectives, and then making sure that you're working to those common KPIs, goals, and objectives. And then whatever decision you're making at that more strategic level, understand or bring the planning organization in on what you're trying to do, as they can then come and help you. Whether you're looking to expand into new markets, increase, more plants, add a line into this facility, just, understand what the implications of that are. And then and then bring planning on board, and they can sort of tell you and help you, okay, by doing this, you'll be able to increase capacity, but watch this because this product needs this, or this supplier is over here. So I think it's just, as we talked about before, when we're talking about the mistakes we'd made, understand the process and the transparency, because at the end of the day, those leaders will be making the big decisions, and rightly so, and they need to do that. But then just give the transparency to the organization, and particularly the planning organization, about what they're trying to do. Normally what happens is it's that what we call the integrated business planning or sales and operations planning process. We're trying to get the alignment between demand and supply, and sort of then the financial piece to it. And so it's just ensuring that, commercial is sort of saying something, supply is saying something else. Are they all sort of moving in the right direction towards that and not being siloed? And that's the hope by having those planning systems, that you can see the demand, you can see the supply, and see what the implications of those things are. And so having that from a process perspective, a people perspective, technology, data, metrics, and policies, sort of making sure those are aligned and moving in the same direction. That's where we see the biggest opportunity is. And the companies, your top supply chain, you know, your top 20 supply chain companies, those that are sort of, you know, on all of those sort of lists at the top half, those are companies that do those areas much, much better.
I feel like I am getting a certificate in planning right now, just from this conversation with you. And I would imagine that all the people listening, unless they are already planning experts, I bet you there's so much knowledge that they're being able to get out of this. Is there any topic, any sort of really passionate sort of subject matter that we haven't talked about that you would like to get out there, that you'd like our audience to be able to kind of learn and know about before we end this episode?
I think the key thing about planning is it comes at different levels and layers, where you can think of strategic planning, where you're next planning for the next 3 to 10 years. Automotive does a lot of that, where they will look at market share and things like that for a 10-year period. Then you can get into sort of the next 1 to 2 years. What am I going to do the next few months, then weeks and days, and then you're executing. So planning covers that whole broad spectrum of things. And I think people can figure out sort of where they enjoy. Some people are like where the rubber hits the road on execution, as you talked about transportation and warehouse. Others are, let me take a step back and sort of figure out over the next 3 to 18 months what I'm going to do. Or others are like, oh, in the next 5 years, we're going to go into this place. I'm going to need a new plant here and things like that. So that's the advantage with planning, is it's very, very broad, and people can sort of find out, you know, where they, you know, sort of want to be. Me personally, I like it more on the supply side, and I like it sort of more in the sort of days time frame, where what am I going to make for the next 2 or 3 weeks and days, and I start to come out with not only my plan and my sequence, but my schedule, and really look deep into constraints and orders and things like that. Sort of stemming from where I did my PhD, I think that's where I personally like to gravitate to.
The way that you talk about it, I feel like planning is this like sleeping beast that's just on the other side of the hill that I've not really gotten to encounter very much, because I've been more toward the end process of the supply chain process, right?
Sure.
The transportation and distribution piece. And I mean, you almost got me sold on wanting to go try my hand on the planning side of the house, right?
You definitely should. I think everybody should.
But definitely for those students that come to me and say, hey, I want to be in procurement and sourcing and planning, you know, these conversations that I'm having with folks like you really help give me some ammunition to be able to go back to them and give them some real tangible advice, you know. So I, again, just thanks for coming on, and I appreciate you taking the time to do this. It took a minute to get through all the processes and hoops that we needed to go through to get this happening, and I, for one, think it was well worth it, and appreciate you just being in my network and being a friend.
Nathan, I really appreciate your patience and diligence with me and just getting to this place. I was very keen to speak, and I'm glad we were able to make this happen. So thank you so very much for making this happen. Thank you.